Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. This is the Inclusion First Project's Anti-Racism for Allies question and answer session. And today we are talking all about how to talk about race. My name is Carrie Sawyer, and I am joined here by two incredible co-host special guests that I'm going to let introduce themselves. First, we have Michäele Antoine, and she is the creator and founder of Curios, and she is also our very first Inclusion First Ally Award winner. So we're excited to have her and her expertise here today. And then second, we have the amazing Renee Ghaheri, and she is a environmental health specialist and diversity, equity, inclusion advocate. She is amazing and brilliant, both women are, and we're going to have an incredible conversation today. So Michäele, will you please introduce yourself?
Yes, of course. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Carrie for having me and to Renee for joining us on this awesome panel. Very excited to be here. I created and founded a company called Curios, which aims to take the training wheels off talk. And that was after working for a couple of years as a creative content producer, years prior to that. And that's in the event management creative production space. But prior to that, I worked in higher education, which is kind of where I honed in on my DEI facilitation and workshopping skills. So working with students, professionals, graduate students to curate experiences that have to do with our identities and digging into how those identities impact how we interact with others. So I'm really excited to get into the nitty-gritty of this because having tough talks is one of my passions. So I'm really excited to get into it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michäele. Renee, please introduce yourself as well.
Hi there. So my name is Renee Ghaheri. I am an environmental health specialist. My areas of focus are primarily in biomedical research until about 4 years ago when I transitioned to healthcare. And while my role is actually quality and workplace safety based, the reality is that I'm just happy to be here and grateful to be invited to participate in this discussion because I, like most people, are probably wondering, how can I be a DEI advocate and what is it like to be an ally? So I am an every person, just eager to learn and take part in the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much, ladies. Okay, so I am going to share my screen really fast. We're just going to go over the flow for tonight really quick, and then we will jump right into questions. Here we go, full screen view. Okay, so what to expect tonight. First, we're going to set the collective tone. We're going to talk about some definitions. I really love to get everyone on the same page. So our first questions are going to be around like anti-racism and allyship. What do those two things mean? And then we're going to jump right into the questions that we have had submitted for this session. And so if you have a question that you brought, but you didn't send it in ahead of time, you can share that at any point in the Q&A or in the chat. I will be keeping an eye on that. And yeah, if anything sparks for, if you want to have a dialogue in the chat, feel free. If you'd like to submit an anonymous question through the Q&A, you can do that by going in, clicking on your name. There's a little down arrow there, and then you can switch it to anonymous so that no one will actually know who submitted that question. So feel free to participate in the Q&A in the chat in whatever way you would like. All right, so creating a positive space. So the Inclusion First Project really is a judgment-free, safe space for people to come and ask the questions that they have, whether you think that question is dumb, you should have learned it already, or maybe even it's a little bit racist. There is no shame and there's no blame. So it really is a judgment-free zone. And I like to have this slide and have this little talk at the beginning, because what we're doing besides answering questions is also modeling how to talk about race. And so you can take some of these tips back into your own conversations with your friends, your family, your colleagues as well. And one of the first points that I like to bring up is that we are speaking for ourselves only. So I am not speaking for all Black women. Michäele is not speaking for everyone who lives in Ocean Beach. Renee is not speaking for everyone who wears glasses and lives in North Park, right? We are only speaking for ourselves. And so as you're having these conversations, what I encourage you to do is just take that person for who they are and what they share with you. We're dropping all assumptions, anything that we may have heard or thought, and just really honing in on the people that we're talking with. The second point that I like to bring up is that we don't know everything. And very similarly, I don't know everything about being Black or about being a woman. It's really difficult to know. No one does everything about any subject. I don't know, Michelle, Renee, is there any subject that you know everything about?
Nope.
Of
Like to
course
think
not.
so, but no.
Exactly, we do like to think so.
Yeah.
So with this one, like, we're going to be learning and growing with you all at the same time that we're having these conversations. We're going to be challenged, we might be triggered. We're just going to have this conversation real time in a respectful way to just show how that can actually play out. And because we don't know everything, because we're constantly learning, that brings us to the next bullet. This is a lifelong journey, right? You don't just like do one thing, get your anti-racism stamp and say, okay, I'm good, I'm out. Like, I got my stamp, I'm done. No. Every day you have the opportunity to interrupt the racism that's happening around you. And so we're learning how to identify it, what we can do about it, how to talk about it. And every single person is at a different point in their journey. And there is no wrong place to be, and there's no wrong place to jump in. So we really appreciate you being here today to take some more steps on your anti-racism journey. The final thing that I like to say is that your role in driving change will be unique. We are all uniquely positioned in our own sphere of influence. And so our job is to go out there, look around us, and figure out where we can have an impact. That might be in your home. It might be at your children's school. It might be at your work. It might be a place where you volunteer. It could be on the street, right? And so we all have a unique opportunity. And in this anti-racism journey, we're constantly on the lookout for where that is and where we can have an impact to continue and pushing the work forward, if that makes sense. So Renee and Michelle, anything else that you would add to this, creating this safe, like, learning environment?
No, I don't think so. I think that really covers it, and I think that was a great sort of overview as to, you know, what our viewers or participants can expect. So
Yeah, I guess I would just say lean into the discomfort. If something you hear is a bit triggering or makes you uncomfortable, like if you have a pad and paper next to you, maybe take some notes about why that might be. I guess I would just say to lean into it, because I think sometimes we tend to shy away or like lean out of things that are, you know, uncomfortable. But I think especially for these conversations, this is the time to dig into it.
Yep.
definitely.
I love that. I may add that bullet, Michelle. Thank you. Because it's time for us to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? We've heard that said a lot. And this is a new topic for some people. And we're talking about it in a new and not evolved in like more advanced way, but just like it's a different time. It's a different way. So much stuff has happened. We're in a very unique point in history. And so we're going to be uncomfortable because it's new and it's change that we're wanting. And no one likes change, that we all like on the other side of the change that we're bringing when it's, you know, this positively focused.
Yeah.
All right, so we're going to jump into the questions. And again, if you have anything that sparks for you, feel free to throw that in the Q&A or the chat. So ladies, I would love to start off just by talking at a high level, like in your experience, like what does it mean to be an anti-racist? What does it mean, what does anti-racism mean to you?
Should I go first?
Yeah, you can. Go ahead.
So for me, anti-racism means the exact opposite of racism, right? So I guess for me, I've always viewed the concept of anti-racism as something that isn't something that I guess you can just sort of process and hold internally. I believe that it requires action. I think that it requires active thinking, active participation, and a willingness to just kind of learn. You know, so I guess I look at it as being anti-racist and sort of serving as an ally as someone that sort of is willing to acknowledge some of the inequalities and some of the things that are going on, but does more than just acknowledge it, really actually tries to process it, internalize it, and think of how they, on even an individual level, can sort of participate and bring about change, you know? So talk about it, as Michelle said at the beginning, you know, lean into the discomfort sometimes. Sometimes that's what it means.
Yeah, I guess I would add that I think, you know, obviously Dr. Kennedy is part of the big reason we're having this conversation, and kind of how to be an anti-racist has just taken over in terms of the conversation about, you know, racism and how to hopefully move away from it in this country. But I think that Renee is absolutely right. I think it's 100% about action. And I think that that's one of the distinctions he makes, is that like, you can't like be, it's one or the other. Like you can't be, there's no like middle ground with anti-racism. You either are racist or you're anti-racist. And I think that that's hard, I think, and maybe a little bit uncomfortable for folks, because we all have had moments, myself included, as a Black woman, have had moments of like doing something that I later maybe realized was low-key racist, and we've all internalized a lot of the messaging that we've gotten in education and in the workplace and wherever else that you know, really perpetuates racism. But I think to be an anti-racist really means, and I think it's different than allyship, in the sense that it's action, it's an action verb. I think to be an ally is a little bit more passive. And I think to be an anti-racist means that in every situation in which you hear, see, feel, witness, you know, racism, you are really making the effort and sometimes the unpopular decision to do something, say something about it.
Exactly.
I
Yes.
love that. Yeah. It is about that action. And I do love what Dr. Kendi says. It makes us uncomfortable to be like, I'm either this or I'm this. There is no Switzerland, to Michelle's point. You're either interrupting racism or you're allowing it to continue. And that really is that's the only thing. So Race Forward has a really great definition. It's like the work of actively opposing racism by advocating for changes in political, economic, and social life. And so it just talks about how this speaks to racism is in everything. It's in every thread, which means we have lots of opportunities to interrupt it. And I think some of the hardest work, because it has been so normalized for a lot of people, is to like identify where that's happening around them and how, and then knowing what to do and how to interrupt it.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So Michäele, you started to speak a little bit about allyship. Can you say a little bit more about what allyship means to you? And then Renee, I'm going to have you also jump in on what you think allyship is and what that looks like.
Yeah, so I think, you know, as I mentioned, I think allyship is a little bit more of, especially now that, and language is important here, because, you know, that's not to say that if you consider yourself an ally, this is not as good. I'm not here to make a value judgment on the word or the identity of ally, but I do think that now that we have kind of a stronger sense, particularly in the shift that we need to make with anti-racist, I think that ally now has kind of taken the definition and role of support. Like you might be supportive of people who are marginalized or a part of a marginalized community. And maybe sometimes you do speak up, but I think that to take on the identity of an anti-racist means to do the hard work of every single time. Whereas allies, like, I understand that, I support it, I acknowledge it, like Renee mentioned, but it's not necessarily like the stance, like this will not stand in my presence. Like I won't accept anything other than anti-racist behavior around me. And I think that that's a distinction. I think that, you know, ally, I think a lot of people took comfort in ally because I was like, oh yeah, like I'm all about, you know, if to just compare it to other marginalized groups, I'm all about LGBTQ rights. I'm all about Black, you know, Black Lives Matter. I'm all about this, but what are you doing about it, right? Like what the act part, like what are you acting, how are you acting and showcasing that in your day-to-day life? I would say that that's the difference for me.
Yes, exactly. I ditto. I think that that's very, very well put. And I too would agree with that sort of, you know, notion that while an ally is wonderful, it's exceptional, right? We need allies. Support is key. At the end of the day, it is very, very different from someone that would like to be, you know, an active anti-racist, because again, as we started this conversation, it's not always fun, right? There are times where I've been in those situations and it's not pleasant, but the reality is that to be anti-racist typically is going to require some sort of action. And allyship means, hey, listen, I sympathize, I understand, I have familiarized myself with what's going on, and I'm going to, make it clear that I'm in support of these concepts. But again, very, very different from being willing to put yourself in a position to say, no, not going to work for me, or I think it's time that we do it this way because that way wasn't working. Luckily for me, I'm a naturally assertive person. I don't mind that person sometimes, but the truth is, they certainly rely on each other, but they are in fact different.
Yes, and I think that the word allyship has been like, the ideal of it is that it is exactly like anti-racism, that it is an active thing, right? And so we've started to hear things like performative allyship, where it looks like, you black out your Facebook page and you're like, yay, ally. But really,
this.
exactly, what else did you do?
Right.
And so thinking about why you're doing something also helps you to understand, like, am I an ally, or am I just doing this because I like, like virtue signaling, right? Like, I just want to show you, show the world. But as far as like putting my skin out there, putting my neck on the line, like it stops, right? So that's not true allyship. So I love what you both kind of brought to this definition, and hopefully that kind of helped people to think about, okay, this is, what we're doing here, anti-racism for allies. We're wanting, you can't have inactive allies in anti-racism.
No.
So we're learning. And, the thing is, if you're on this journey, even being here, even learning, even questioning, even thinking, like, that is part of the journey, right? That's part of the experience. And you're just really trying to keep stepping forward. To figure out how you can have that impact.
Yes.
We got a question in the Q&A. It always makes me happy to get questions. It's like money for me. So the question is around ally to anti-racist. So what is the first step in transitioning from an ally to an anti-racist? Is there an initiative or activity that you would recommend to allies who are beginning that transition?
Ooh, that's a really great question. I think that the transition begins, and Carrie talked and touched on this in our discussion about allyship, but I think it begins inward. So to me, the journey, and this is always what I talk about, just in terms of having any kind of difficult conversation, regardless of if you're talking about racism, regardless if you're talking about any kind of bigotry, like, you kind of have to go inward to understand where that comes from for you, because in every individual story of racism and kind of your racist ideology, your particular brand of racism is not necessarily like, yes, we all have similarities in terms of how we ingested it. And again, we talked about this in education and media, et cetera. But what it looks like in terms of your lived experiences is going to be really different than someone else. So I say that the journey from allyship to anti-racism begins inward, because if you don't start there, you're going to lean into conversations that are particularly hard and be reactive and not really know why you're being reactive, or you're going to say something and not even have an understanding of why that might be harmful to someone else. So I think that kind of looking within and seeing where the crevices and where racism might be hiding out within. And like I said earlier on, I think it's in all of us. That's my belief, that it's in all of us in some way, shape, or form. So I think that you have to kind of do the hard work, just like with mental health, just like with anything else, to find it in you before you can try to point it out in other people, because then it's not coming from a genuine place either.
Yes. Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think that oftentimes it's sort of human nature to sort of peek under a rock and see something scary and say, no, I don't want to see that right now, right? Like, that's human nature. But the reality is, I mean, for me, when, I'm a woman of color, I'm a woman of many colors. So I've sort of been aware of sort of racial inequities for the majority of my life. But the reality is that I too had to really take a hard look at who I am, what I think, what I believe, and why do I believe and think that way. And that's not always easy, but I do believe that the first step is in fact having that willingness to look under the rock, remind yourself it ain't gonna hurt me, you know, it's not gonna be pretty, but I don't know what's there unless I take a look at it and accept it for what it is. So for me, I think that that's really where it starts, is, as Michäele said, it really does start internally, a willingness to acknowledge, hey, this is something that we should all be aware of, and B, is this something that I actually want to take part in? But first and foremost, you have to be willing to do that hard work.
Can I add something? I would also say that sometimes I think some people, and this goes back to what we all said about acknowledgement, right? Like, I think some people take that for face value and think like, oh, well, I'm ready to acknowledge that I have some. So, okay, I'm ready to have this conversation. Slow down. I think that, to me, like, this takes time. Like Carrie said this early on in the introduction, like it's not a one and done. It's not like you might know something intellectually, but you might not really understand it until maybe some of those things start, like some of your childhood memories or some of the things you were taught in school, or you have to kind of go back and like, I mean, dig, you know, like, I mean, like, explore some of those thought processes that you have. So the acknowledgement isn't really enough. A great book to do this with, I think, is Me and White Supremacy. Because I do think that, like, that helps in terms of the journal prompts, and it forces you to reflect and not just stay at the surface of these questions that you might, you know, need to go inward. So yeah, I just have to emphasize that it means, like, dig deeper, and you think you have it, you probably don't.
Yeah.
If you think you have it, then you're wrong. And it doesn't really matter where you are in this phase, because racism is so ingrained in all of us and so many things. There's absolutely a rock that you haven't uncovered or overturned. Turned over is the expression I'm looking for. Even if you've turned over 76 rocks, there's like, you know, a billion more for you to go turn over. And I love the word acknowledge, right? Because so many people won't acknowledge that racism exists, that racism is a problem, that racism is happening around them, and most importantly, to Michäele's point, and also Renee's, that racism is inside of you, right? If you can't acknowledge that, then we're not going to get anywhere, because you're going to be trying to rebuild, to trying to be an ally from the same mindset that has, you know, created, participated in, perpetuated the racist systems that we're all in, right? So even if we can shift ourselves just a little bit, that gets us to a potentially totally different outcome. But if we're not willing to make those shifts, then we're recreating like systems with the same thinking that created the original racist systems to begin with. So absolutely. That was great. I love that. Okay, cool. So we're going to dive into a question, first question from someone who submitted into this site. All right, so this one is about the reading that they were doing, actually, of Dr. Kendi's book. So I'm reading How to Be an Anti-Racist, and it's taught me that it's best to point out when people use, say, or do something racist, because they may not realize that what they are doing, saying, or using is, in fact, racist. But what is the best way to have that conversation without making that person defensive?
That's a good question. You know, so I can give an example, if that's okay. So I sort of encountered a situation like this relatively recently with someone that I've known since childhood, basically. And long story short, she and I were together somewhere, and she made a comment that I considered extremely offensive. And I remember being very surprised by it, but I had to sort of temper that, right? Because she's a teacher. And I remember my gut reaction being very human, right? And I remember thinking, oh God, that's disappointing. You know, I really don't want to hear this. And it almost hurts that it's coming from someone that I thought I knew. And I remember, you know, the comment was made, and I think she just kind of was going to go through the, you know, carry on, right? As if it didn't bother anyone. And it was just she and I together at the time. And I remember telling her just, hey, you know, you said something earlier, and you know me, I focus on stuff, and I just got to tell you that I'm not sure I understand why you feel that way. And she gave her explanation, and again, I'm human. My first reaction was to be, well, that's wrong. Why do you think that? That makes no sense. But I did not say any of that. Instead, I tried to practice my active listening, right? I've taken those courses, and I'm listening, and I'm trying to understand where she's coming from. I let her finish, and then I told her, in a respectful way, hey, listen, I'm sorry that you feel that way, but I gotta tell you that that's actually a very offensive generalization. And I personally find that very offensive. And it was a little weird. It was weird for a minute or two, right? But, we kind of kept talking about it, and she said, you're right. I guess I can kind of see how maybe I need to think about how I phrase things. And I said, yeah, that's kind of a start, right? But if I didn't say that to her, we would have just kept going business as usual. And she probably would have said it again at some point, or perhaps something else that I probably wouldn't have been so calm about, if that makes sense, right? So and again, going back to that discomfort, not everyone's gonna feel okay doing that, but this happened to be someone that I've known for a long time. So I personally felt okay bringing it up. And because I knew her, I kind of knew how to pitch it to her. But nonetheless, I remember thinking, okay, that was awkward for a minute, but I don't regret it, because I know that it was something that she probably needed to hear. And I know that no one has probably ever spoken up about.
Yeah. I mean,
so that's what it looks like sometimes,
Yeah. And I think every situation's going to be different. And I think that, Renee, you talked about knowing this person. So obviously there's that discrepancy. So that means that potentially you might kind of have an idea of how to approach it with someone. If it's someone you don't know, maybe there's a little bit more caution that's exercised, because you don't want to offend and or have the person be defensive. But I also think that this question assumes that you can make this person feel anything, and I disagree. I really believe that, especially if you're coming from a place of curiosity, like it sounds like Renee was coming from as well, and respect, like if you're attacking someone and yelling at them and calling them names, like obviously that's going to incite some defense.
Right.
But I think that if you ask questions about their thought process and interrupt the pattern, like, if it's a joke, for example, like that's actually not that funny. Like that's not, if the person feels defensive after you say that, that's not really about what you said. It's more about what they said. So I think that some of this is practicing this, fear that we have of offending people and making people feel a certain way, because I think that unfortunately this work requires that you kind of bypass that. And if you know your intentions and you are trying to be kind and respectful and illuminate something that you believe is wrong, if you're an anti-racist, then whether or not you make someone feel defensive, or again, I think that the defense is a lot more about what that person's belief system says than what you are actually saying. So I don't know if that's a good response, but that's how I feel about that. And again, I guess a part of me is like, well, if they feel defensive, that's not really about me. As long as you are approaching it from a place of kindness and curiosity, and from your inherent position of, I want to be an anti-racist and I want to address this head on. And again, I won't feel good necessarily, but whether or not that person feels a way is not really your responsibility. I think your responsibility is to try to help them see the light. And it might not happen in that moment, but if you interrupt the pattern, perhaps even later in reflection, if you're lucky, they might be like, oh, okay, I hadn't really thought about that in that way. And that's okay.
Yeah.
Yes, that is a super centered response. Michelle, super
Yeah.
centered. And to Renee's story, like she's like, and I had my human reaction and I breathed
Yeah.
and I tried to like,
Yeah.
she's curating this, right? And that's like the hard work of having these conversations as really
Mhm.
not just people of color, but anyone who's trying to walk in this anti-racism light. But I think that it's really important to know that the conversation, like we have no control over how the conversation is going to go. And I love how you said it, like it's not our responsibility if they feel some kind of way, like it's really, that's not about us. That's about the way that they feel. And I get a lot of questions about how can I talk to people without making them feel defensive. And so people are afraid of having that backlash on them. And so this is part of the getting comfortable with the uncomfortable, because what you can do is stand up in integrity, right? And you can be respectful, like the ladies have said, you can speak your piece, you can ask questions, you can be curious, but then what they do with that is totally outside of your control. And if it goes sideways, then being able to sit with that discomfort and not using that as an excuse to not, call out or call in the next person too, right?
Yes. Yeah. Such
So
a good
it's not
point.
always going to go perfectly or well, right? When we're doing this. And we
No.
also might not be able to manage that human side of us. And we might snap back at someone, right? And that could be completely justified and valid depending upon the kind of day you're having and what was said, right?
Yes.
So,
Right. Yes. Sometimes, hey.
so, and then I also want to speak to, if you are getting this feedback, like what do you do, right? Because it can, like we've talked about, we all have racism inside of us. We have the seeds of racism that are deeply planted in our values, how we think, like how we're, all of this is subconscious, right? So if someone calls you out for racism, and how you can mitigate that human reaction to like fight back, right? To become defensive, to listen. And even if you can't do it in the moment, being able to reflect on that. Because in all feedback, I've heard this from some of the different teachers that I follow, like in every piece of feedback, there's some potential learning and potentially some truth. Even if, you don't agree with them, even if they're way off base, there's something in there that came from that interaction that you had with them. And so can you find that truth? And can you also mitigate those human reactions and listen and take it in? Hey, thank you for sharing that with me. I hadn't thought about that before. I'm going to go think about that. Maybe if it's someone you're close with, you can have a conversation, circle back. But as we are thinking about how to have these difficult conversations, we are going to also be called out or called in for our own thinking, and being prepared for that. And even if we don't do it right the first time, like being able to take that feedback and do something productive with it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Okay. So we're going to talk a little bit about Black Lives Matter in this next one. So how do I convince my white friends and family that the Black Lives Matter movement has anything to do with them? They seem a bit disengaged and don't want to be involved, although they are vocal and outraged by looting and rioting. This has like 8 questions in one. There's so many layers to this.
Yeah.
Okay, so the core of this question is, how can I convince my friends and family that the Black Lives Matter movement matters to them? And then there's that kind of sidebar on the looting and rioting.
Well, again, you can't convince anybody of anything. I mean, all you can do is share your truth and your perspective. I think that, this question has a lot of layers. I think that part of this is, particularly if you're sharing with family and or people who are not necessarily family, if you know that you're sharing with people who are very debate oriented or logic oriented, then I think that it's important for you to be read up on. And that goes back to one of the questions we, talked about earlier, like going inward and educating yourself and starting with you, right? Like, so that you have, for lack of a better word, like your arsenal full of tools to be able to, dispense at any time necessary to kind of share information. But I think that sharing information that's factual and based in statistics because I think that at a human level, racism is wrong. I think we all agree, and hopefully the people who are watching agree as well. And I think that there have been numerous studies, and there's a lot of data that shows now, but that racism does indeed hurt everyone involved. So it doesn't just hurt the Black person who's being oppressed, it hurts economically, it hurts from a kind of intellectual standpoint in the workplace, it hurts the bottom line. Like there's just a lot of different things that it impacts. So I think that being equipped with that information is important, but never going into a conversation with the intention to convince, because again, to me, that's kind of a sure way to not disaster. I mean, I guess it could work, but I think that you have to be able to share from your perspective, from the knowledge you have, from the information you've gathered. And again, always from a place of kindness and respect. And if they don't get it from there are going to be some people who are convinced to misunderstand you. And that's unfortunate. But again, that's not necessarily your problem. Like you can't convince, you have to share. You have to share.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's so perfectly said, right? It's not our job to have this plethora of knowledge at our disposal every minute of every day and know how to instantly tailor it to every single audience that we might encounter on a daily basis. I don't think that that's necessarily realistic, but I love what Michäele said about sort of arming yourself with fact-based information. And, and then the other side of it is, again, depending on who the individual is or what the situation is. Like in my case, going back to my friend, this is someone that I knew as a kid, basically, right? So it's knowing your audience and understanding, I guess, their point too, because as Michäele mentioned, there are some people, right? And we can't get too confused, because it's very easy to let people that are going to disagree no matter what, they will sap that energy, right? And we have to remember that those aren't always the people that we're out there trying to convince or win over or bring to our side. So I think that's where sort of arming yourself with all that fact-based information, and hopefully by that point you've started to do the work internally, right? So you understand where you're coming from, you understand your intention, and I think that ultimately that's kind of the best way to start when you do interact with individuals that may not know exactly, or may just feel differently, or I don't know, even expect you to have all the information, convince me, change my mind right now. Oftentimes that's just not the way it's going to work.
And I think that it's important to have the balance of both, so that you're not coming at it from strictly an emotional place, because again, it's emotional, particularly if you're part of a marginalized community, right?
Yeah.
And again, if it's just emotional, then it's more likely that you're going to fly off the handle, that you're going to cuss someone out, that you're going to, it's easy to go there if you're not also equipped with, hey, but this is why this doesn't make sense. Like it doesn't make sense for you, it doesn't make sense for me, and it's also wrong, like just at a human basic level. So yeah, it's hard.
It's hard. It takes work. It's a constant learning process.
Yeah. And I think one thing to ask yourself when you find yourself in that position of I want to convince someone is like, why? Why do you want to convince them versus understanding them or sharing your perspective with them? And one thing that I've noticed just from these questions coming in, when we want to convince someone, I think it's oftentimes because we don't want them to be a racist. And they are. And it makes us very uncomfortable that these people that we know and love have these feelings that are so wrong. And if they have them, then it means these things about them. And that's super uncomfortable. And so I need to bring you to my side, because I don't want you to be that thing that is terrible and bad and wrong, even though we all have this in us, right? I think a lot of the discomfort comes from that. That's just my hypothesis. And then the second thing that I would say just kind of echoes what these ladies said, like when you're trying to convince someone, you're getting that energy zapped out of you. And I actually think that it is a total waste of time, because there are so many people right now who are raising their hand, who are opening up, who want to move this work forward. Why are you messing with that person over there instead of reaching out to these people over here who are already ready to go, right? You can be moving this way and you're moving that way. And yes, you want to maybe bring that person with you, but why? Like, why is it? Because you don't want them to be left on the racist side of the line. But if that's where they are right now, then that might just have to be where they are. I had a friend at a tech company, and there was like this email that had gone viral in their company about this man who had basically said, like, Black Lives Matter is terrible. Black people have been killing themselves forever. They deserve what's happening to them. All of these things, and backed up by all these like historical facts and like little factoids and things. And she was like, Carrie, oh my God, this thing, read this and then tell me what to say. And I told her what I just told you already. I'm like, that guy, there's nothing that you can say to him that is going to convince him that what he thinks is not true. You can spend 2 weeks looking up all the facts in history to counter argue everything that he said. And that's going to be the biggest waste of your time ever, because you still believe what he believes. Ignore that and go do the work, right? So
no shade, but don't do that. Don't ask your friends to answer.
Yeah.
That's not, I don't know if that really happened or if you're like, this was hyperbole, but geez, like your friend, right? Like that made me cringe.
Yeah. We've been, that was right around like George Floyd, when everyone was texting everyone and asking all kinds of questions that were wildly inappropriate. And we found ourselves emotionally exhausted and constantly in teaching moments. So yeah.
Can I just mention that for a moment? Because I feel like it's important.
It is important.
It's important to mention that like the emotional labor involved in having a conversation about racism, particularly if the person you're talking to is the recipient of racist behavior regularly, it's really important to be mindful of that and to ask them if they have the capacity for that in that moment, to ask the question, like, can we talk about this? Do you have, and if we can't do it now, can you let me know when we can do it? Because just presenting kind of really traumatizing, and a lot of people were talking about that in, when the video of George Floyd was circulating, and the trauma that happens consistently, to be faced with something, again, as traumatic as that video, but also as traumatic as potentially just someone being blatantly racist, is, something that all of us should be carrying, not just people who are of marginalized communities. So I just want to say that as a, PSA for folks who have the information.
Appreciate that. For sure. Agree, 100%.
And that actually takes us really beautifully into the next question. So this is a long one. I'm just going to read the whole thing, because here at the Inclusion First Project, we like take real people's questions and we talk through them. So I'd like to hear how to ask my friends who are people of color, as a person of color myself with different ethnicity, about how they are coping with recent events related to racial injustice, and if there's anything I can do to help them specifically. I'm not asking them about everything I should do to be an ally. That is on me. I also like to hear what's a way to do that without forcing a response, since I've heard both that it's not okay to ask this in certain situations, and also that it's not okay to say, it's okay if you don't want to talk about this right now, because that gives agency away from the person you are approaching. So this person, there's a lot in that question. There's a lot in that question for sure. What do you ladies think?
Well, I guess my, go-to is always to ask the question. I think that not asking is troublesome because it makes an assumption. So, okay, in the example Renee gave with her friend, for example, let's say her friend, let's say it's a different friend. Let's say that she has a friend who is a Black male, and, this was a couple of months ago and everything was happening. If she knows this person really well, to me, it's pretty simple, or not simple, but I think you're able to use your better judgment based on the history you've had with this person to send them some food, or to send them some flowers, or to do an action that they enjoy because you know them, and you know that this will alleviate some stress in some way because they enjoy this thing, this show, the spa, like whatever, and not a spa because whatever, but like whatever they will take enjoyment out of, and maybe we'll take some pressure off. If it's someone you don't know, I think the only answer is to ask. If you don't know them that well and you don't have a relationship, making an assumption to me is a bad idea. And jumping to a, yeah, just it's never a good idea to assume, especially if you don't have the kind of knowledge or the historical knowledge you need to know how to support someone.
Mhm.
So that's my thought on that.
Right. And I would add that, so, and on the other side of things, you know, and I'll use myself as an example. Obviously, you know, referencing George Floyd, this was extremely traumatic. I, like a lot of other people, had a hard time processing that. So I think that, sort of building on what Michäele said, I don't think that in general, right, it's a good idea to sort of slap someone's hand for showing interest. I don't think that that's necessarily what we want to do, but I also would say that as the person that is sort of eager to learn, how can I approach this topic? How can I educate myself? How can I let my friend or my family know that I'm thinking of them? I think that that's wonderful and that's great, but it's also important to bear in mind that that person may also be dealing with other stuff, right? So and using myself as an example, at the time, I was probably not the best person to be pinging with those questions, because the truth is, like everyone else, I was trying to process the trauma of what was happening. So I think, like Michäele said, maybe if it's someone you know, using having an in be, you know, sending them the cookies they like from some bakery first, to let them know, listen, I'm here for you first and foremost. I'm not necessarily trying to come to you while you're sort of dealing with a lot and then ask you to give me more information and feed me what I want to know right now. I think it really just comes down to that mutual understanding and respect and empathy, and being willing to consider that not everyone is going to be in that right frame of mind at that moment to give you that answer, give you that information. Maybe ask me in 3-4 months. I don't know, maybe 3-4 weeks. It might be different, but I do think that that's another really key part of this, because right at the end of the day, when you ask a question, you want the response you receive to be helpful and you want it to have answered your question. So one of the best ways to do that is to consider the approach that you take.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. I think that you know, when people ask and you don't get that response that you want, it's the same as before when we're like, you can't convince someone. If someone gets a feeling about something, it's not about you, right? So don't take that personally, and don't take that as a you should never ask anyone, because it totally does depend. It depends a lot on the relationship that you have with that person. And there are a lot of people in your lives who you might want to ask who you're not as close with, right? And so then that is like a riskier situation. But I think, to Michäele's point, asking and letting people know, hey, I'm not sure if this is okay. I'm trying to learn, but just let me know what is the right thing to do for you, and just being open. And again, not putting any more weight on that person. I feel like there was an article that went viral around the time that George Floyd was murdered, and it was like, your Black friends are not okay. And so like everyone started texting me, and people I hadn't heard from in forever. I'm just like, what is going on? I saw people called me and I was like, oh yay, my friend's calling. And then like proceeded to like emotionally dump all of their on me. And I'm like, what is going on? I'm suffering too.
Yeah.
So I think that for me, the biggest thing is not putting extra weight on someone, giving them the opportunity to let them know that you are there as a support, but not requiring that work back from them. And we had another question that's similar to this around work. And I think that as a manager, it's super important for you to create a safe space for not just your employees of color, because they're definitely having different feelings and experiences that are impacting their work, but also other people who have questions. And you know, a lot of HRs aren't honestly equipped to deal with what we're dealing with right now. But working with the experts at your work before you start these conversations, but not delaying. You know, I had people who were like, yeah, my manager, you know, George Floyd happened, Breonna happened, my manager asked me how I was once. Not okay, right? If you're in a leadership position, you have to figure out how to create that safe space. And you might screw up, but apologize and do better, right? Educate yourself, learn what to do. I think that not asking in cases like that, especially with everything that's going on right now, if you're in a workplace, is doing more damage than making a mistake with a good intent behind it.
Mm. Yeah.
Let me check on the time real quick. So, okay, it's 4:51. It goes super fast. I'm gonna do one more question, then maybe we can do a final remarks. Ooh, wait, we have a question in the Q&A. Okay, this might have been from before. So this is a little bit about Black Lives Matter. So sorry to get political. How can you speak to someone about Black Lives Matter and systemic racism when they have alternative facts from Fox News or from the president himself? These conversations tend to go nowhere in my experience, and they say stuff like, the president has reduced Black on Black crime, parroting something that they heard. Yeah, so I think that we kind of covered this just in the sense, like, don't waste your time. Like, you want to convince that person, but like, don't.
Don't do it. Don't do it.
Like, hey, do you want to have an actual conversation about this, or are you just looking to confirm what you think you know? Because I think that, again, like, that will save you a lot of time too. If they say yes and they continue to berate you after this, then just don't engage with this person ever again. But if they say like yes, and they actually listen to you, that could go somewhere. But I think that trying to get a sense from them of like, do you want to fight right now? Or are you really trying to have like a conversation where I can share some facts from some reputable sources, and you can do the same if you think they're reputable, ? And we can like talk about those and maybe why they're not reputable.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's Carrie's right. Like, sometimes you just can't waste your time. Like,
yeah, sometimes it's not worth the energy, right? Put the energy maybe where it belongs. Not every, I actually had run into this with a distant family member that I learned the hard way is pro Fox News. And, you have to make the decision, right? For me, it was like a work night, and it was like 8:30 at night or something. And I'm like, yeah, not the time. We can revisit this later. As Michelle said, are we going to have like an actual conversation? But if not, not everyone's worth the energy, and not every conversation is worth the energy.
And I know there are people that we care about that you like, maybe it's your mom, or maybe it's your sister or your cousin, someone that you're close with, and you're like, but I can't let it go with them because they need to come over to my side. And then it goes right back to that, like, why are you so uncomfortable with where they are? It's
right.
If they feel the way they feel, it's a reality, and it'd be better for you to accept that and then come back versus trying to drag them over to your side very unwillingly, and is what it is in a lot of cases. So
yeah.
Okay, I'm still gonna do one more question, and then we're gonna do our wrap-ups. Because I think this one is a good one too, just to kind of close us out on the work front for a lot of people who are in offices and working, well, not in, but remotely. So, if at all, under what circumstances is it appropriate to invite friends or colleagues of color to consult, present, provide feedback, resources, or in any way help our organization become more diverse in a healthy, meaningful, and authentic way? Go.
So the question was, when is there a good time, right? Did I hear that correctly? I think all the time is a good time. The organization that I'm with right now, I actually really want to commend them, because the reality is it's not an easy thing to talk about. I remember when I was first kind of starting my career and sort of pre-Black Lives Matter, I remember being at work and being subjected to some of the most inappropriate, racially charged comments. And I remember at that time, though, thinking, it really sucks that there isn't more kind of education and awareness. Like, I was wide-eyed and new to working at the time, and I'm just like, how is this person asking me this at work? And I'm not supposed to react, in a negative way. So I think that there's always space for organizations to reach out and let their employees know that they are valued, that they, just like regular folks, may not know the answers to everything, but that they are in fact available, and that there is a willingness to listen and learn. For me, in my case, I have found that these sort of safe speak type situations have been the most productive. So kind of like, Carrie, what you did here, right? Creating a space where it's like, listen, this is just dialogue. There are no right answers. There are no, well, there could be some wrong answers, but we're here to learn together. And so personally, while admittedly, I don't want to come into work every day and have a new work email about some workshop that I need to be in that afternoon, then you're kind of teetering on, well, I don't know how helpful that is. Now you're making something that's important sort of trivial by burying it in with everything else and making it a requirement all day. But I think that there's, in many ways, from a workplace standpoint, there are lots of opportunities to have that conversation and to engage with your workforce. And one of the best ways to figure out when a good time is might be to ask. It's a crazy idea, but maybe start there.
Yeah. Could you repeat the question, Carrie?
Yes. So under what circumstances is it appropriate to invite friends or colleagues of color to consult, present, provide feedback, resources, or in any way help our organization become more diverse? And so Renee, thank you so much for that, because that was basically just all around like, when should companies be doing this work? And so in this question, they're asking a little bit around like asking people of color to do the work for them.
Yeah, I think you have to ask if they want to. Because it's like, and that's happened, I think, to all of us in some capacity, to be kind of be asked to be the spokesperson for, this diversity training or whatever it is. And while for some of us, it is something we want to do, it's something we want to engage in, we want to lead the conversation. But sometimes it isn't. So I would agree with Renee that it's always okay to ask. I think if someone wants to and if they're interested in, but I don't think it's okay to expect. If they don't want to, or they don't want to do that emotional labor, then it shouldn't be, if it's not a part of their job, like if their responsibilities to do so, then they shouldn't be expected, and there should be no consequences for not. And unfortunately, I do think like that's happened to me at a previous role where there was a consequence for being presented with an opportunity, saying I wasn't interested in the opportunity, and then it was kind of like I was reprimanded for it, and I was like, I'm confused. Like, I don't understand what's happening here.
That's not good.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think historically, a lot of brown people have raised their hand to do the work because we have ideas and we have a passion for creating a better space, and it pertains directly to us. And so now that we are we'll say this new reemergence of the civil rights movement, you can ask the people of color in your organization, sure, but you should be asking everyone to do this work, for sure.
Right.
Also, before you come to those people, before you even assemble anything, do your due diligence as an organization to figure out what it is even that you should or could or would be doing. So you're not putting all this work on people who aren't experts in this space. Find some experts and figure out what to do, get people to volunteer and to help. And in this space, in this particular question, I just want to reiterate just the importance of having a diverse group of people. And in this case, diverse doesn't mean brown, diverse means white, to help with this space, because right now we're opening, the people's hearts and minds are opening towards anti-racism, away from racism in a way that it hasn't before. And so in order for that to stick, we all have to work together. And no program can make someone not racist. That person has to make themselves not racist, right? You have to do that work. And so when white people step into this space and start doing this work, they're modeling, they're learning themselves, they're coming to the table in a way that typically, the room for the diversity training is mostly the diverse people, right? So just putting that call to action out there, that engaging our white colleagues, friends, peers, is so important. And when you're starting these committees, start with those people, because there are people who want to make a difference. They want to have an impact. They want to know what they can do. This could be your thing, right? It could be your thing. So that's all that I'll say about that. Okay, ladies, thank you so much. This has been incredible. We are just a couple minutes over, but I would love to just hear if you have any just kind of final wrap-up questions, anything that you want people to take away from this discussion about how to talk about race.
Well, like I said at the beginning, it might not always be comfortable, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It's like exercise, right? Like, might not always be the most fun. It might be difficult to get out there and do it, but I think that at the end of the day, it really is an important discussion to have. And I think that it's okay. And and maybe the most important thing is to understand that it's okay not to know. It's okay not to have all the answers. I do not have all the answers. I am continuing to learn every single day, participating today. I'm learning from you two wonderful ladies. And I think that it's okay. So I would recommend that people just sort of bear that in mind. You're not going to have all the answers overnight. No one should expect you to have all the answers overnight, but understand that it is a process and it's something that will take active work on a daily basis at an individual level. It may happen at the grocery store, but start small. Don't think that for 1 minute it's your responsibility to know everything all at once, and just don't be afraid of the discomfort. We're here to learn. Just learn, open up, listen, and be, aware and open to the experiences of other people. That's really how you're going to get the most out of this discussion, this topic, and I think most importantly, out of allyship in general.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think I would echo the lean into discomfort sentiment. And I would also say start with you. A lot of the questions are about convincing and, how to persuade and like, how do I get someone else to understand some of this information? And again, I think that there's certainly time and place for that. But I think that if every individual person can do some self-work in this area, I think that's where hopefully we'll get to a place that enough people are doing it, that then the conversations become a little bit less triggering, a little bit less like you need to do any convincing, because I've already done some work on myself to learn about what this means for me. And then we can engage in a conversation rather than a debate. So I think starting with you is important.
Yeah. Absolutely. I love that. Thank you ladies both. This has been an incredible conversation. I know that we could have kept going, kept answering more and more questions. I would love to continue this dialogue with you. So everyone, thank you so much for tuning in today or whenever you're watching this. If you want to learn more about the Inclusion First Project, you can do so at our website, inclusionfirstproject.org. Michäele and Renee, tell people where they can connect with you if they want to keep the dialogue going.
Ah, yes. So I am on LinkedIn, Renee Ghaheri. I know it is a funny spelled last name, but I'm sure it's in the notes somewhere. So I'm Renee Ghaheri on LinkedIn. I am Renee Ghaheri on Instagram. I am also Renee Ghaheri on Facebook. Please look me up. This was so fun. If there's anything that you think I might be able to help with or answer, or you just want to educate me on something, I'm around. Please do so.
Yeah, and I think people can find me by name on LinkedIn and on Instagram, but on my website is a great place to find more about the work I do, and that's at www.curios, so curious without the second U, by nature.com. And hopefully I see some of y'all on the internet somewhere.
Awesome. Thank you, ladies, so much. So we have.
Thank you.
Sorry, Renee. Sorry. We have 2 more sessions that will be happening here in November to close out the year. On November 11th, we are going to be doing a post-election, not a recap, but through the lens of anti-racism, what now? What does the work look like now based on whatever happens? So definitely tune in for that. And then we'll be doing one last session on the 18th before we shut down for the year to create a kick-ass January in 2021 for everyone. So Renee and Michäele, thank you again. Thank you so much for being here.
Yay, that was fun. Thank you so much for the invitation. This was great.
Thank you for having us.
Yes. so much. We will see everyone next time.
Yes. Bye,
Bye.
everyone.